I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here tonight. You are at the GeneSight Cares webinar. My name is Dr. Rachel Earls, and I am thrilled to be your moderator this evening. A little bit of background on myself. I received my PhD in molecular neuroscience and bachelor's of science in psychology from the University of Georgia. I was a National Science Foundation fellow that focused on leadership and engagement around research focused on improving mental health conditions. So currently, I am the medical science liaison for Myriad Mental Health in the Southeast, and I am honored to be your moderator tonight. Our panelists tonight represent an incredible cross-section of medicine, and I'm so grateful that they are here with us. First, I'm going to introduce Dr. Carson Felkel, who is a child and adolescent psychiatrist and the systems medical director for the Bon Secours Mercy Health Center in Greenville, South Carolina. Good evening, Dr. Felkel. Thank you so much for being here tonight.
Great to be here. Thank you.
And next, we have Dr. Ben Inventor, who is the Director of Adult Gerontology Primary Care Nurse Practitioner Program, as well as an assistant professor at the Rush University College of Nursing in Chicago, Illinois. Welcome, Dr. Inventor. Thrilled to have you here on our panel tonight.
I'm thrilled to be here. Welcome from the city of wind, the windiest city in the state. So I'm glad to be here. Thank you.
You're so welcome. And last but certainly not least, Dr. Crystal Nelson is an adult psychiatrist and the owner and CEO of Blueprint Psychiatry in Noonan, Georgia, who I have had the absolute pleasure of working with before. Dr. Nelson, it's great to see you. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Dr. Earls. Thank you, everybody, for being here tonight.
All right, so we will go ahead and jump right in because we have limited time. We know that 83% of those diagnosed with depression say life would be easier if others could understand how depression makes them feel, according to the latest GeneSight Mental Health Monitor survey. Yet, unless you have firsthand experience with depression, it's hard just to grasp how daunting depression may be. And this can create a feeling of disconnect between those suffering from depression and those who may not have experienced depression before. So what we're here tonight to talk about is how to bridge the disconnect and increase understanding about how depression feels. So Dr. Nelson, let me start with you. Do you hear about this disconnect from your patients? And if so, how do you respond?
I think it's a pretty common thing for patients to have the complaint that they feel like the people around them or even their other providers don't understand them. I think that I probably hear that multiple times a day, that no one understands. I usually start off by trying to help my patients feel validated. So I will usually tell them that it does not require someone to understand your feelings for your feelings to be real, for them to be validated. So just to kind of break the ice. And then of course I will attempt to understand, what they are growing through. But it's going to be hard for many people around them to understand exactly what they might be experiencing.
Absolutely. And I love the point you made that you don't have to be understood for your feelings to be valid, but we know sometimes it would be easier if we did feel understood.
Right.
Dr. Felkel, do you have any experience with hearing about this disconnect from your patients?
Yes, I actually heard about one situation today. And the way that I kind of lump depression or depressive symptoms in my mind are some patients, if we had to just have two big groups, we would say a lot of patients may have an increase in negative affect. They have more anxiety, worries. Depression feels like pain that they just can't describe. It's just this burden of negative feelings. On the other hand, some patients have something that's very different, where they have a loss of positive feelings. We sometimes call this anhedonia. Patients just don't feel happy anymore. And in psychiatry, our medicines are a little bit better at taking down the bad feelings. They're not really that great at helping to bring good feelings. That's like exercise, good sleep, those types of things that increase endorphins. But those are just two groups of people, or phenotypes, as I like to think of it, I think, Dr. Earls, you said that on this call, we actually have, you all opened it up to patients, peers for the first time that likely are struggling with depression. And even in the provider world, we know that 1 in 2 people across their lifetime are probably going to have some type of mental health struggle. And so many of us on this call tonight have experienced some of this. And so we may not know exactly what's going on, but we can certainly walk through life together, trying to seek to know what it's like to be someone.
And also to add in that, when someone's depressed, there's already a disconnect sometimes from themselves from other people around them, from the environment, from social things, and from their family. So there's already a disconnect there that it's difficult for them to understand deep within the patient themselves, and plus the fact that around them may also have difficulty understanding because they haven't felt the same way. So there's that disconnect as well. So yeah, bridging the disconnect between the patients and the provider and the family and all those around is very important.
Thank you for that. And I think we've all talked about how this pandemic has affected our mental health. And so do we think that there's a silver lining to the pandemic and the fact that maybe we created a greater culture of understanding with depression? And I'll open that to anyone who thinks they have a response.
I'd be happy to start. So a recent study looked at 236,000 patients that have been diagnosed with COVID. And we know that that's not even a portion of people, because a lot of people had COVID and just weren't even diagnosed in the early days where we weren't testing everybody. And 1/3 of those individuals has a brain issue. It could be depression, PTSD, anxiety, brain fog, fatigue. This is all in the brain. And so if there is a silver lining, I think it's helping us, no matter what field you're in, to recognize that these symptoms really do originate in the brain. Yes, there's a large effect from the social determinants of health and loneliness. But because we're now having a common language of a brain disorder following COVID, I think there's a lot of momentum for this to be named and more out in the open and to decrease stigma.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, today, I saw 2 patients today who are post-COVID who I was treating previously for ADD, and they are now describing symptoms of clinical depression. So I think this is, just like Dr. Felkel said, it's creating a common language. I think that will be a bit easier for people to understand, even those who have not experienced depression in the past. This may be new for them, but that understanding that patients are looking for, I think we just hit a larger part of the population that will be able to relate with a bit more ease because of post-COVID related symptoms.
I agree. I also wanted to add that, it was brought up that depression is kind of an abnormality of the function of the brain as an organ, right? We don't blame the person when they have depressive symptoms, because now it's a function of the brain. We don't blame someone if they have asthma, that they have weak system. And so if we focus or we attack this issue on a physiological function, that there's something that we can do about it as a disease, then we normalize it. And the stigma is very high when it comes to mental health, that it's probably the most problematic barrier that one could face in diagnosing and treating depression.
That's a great comment, Dr. Inventor. I completely agree. I've heard many people say, like, how are you doing? Everyone's like, oh, I'm stressed out. And I think if anyone's not stressed out during this time, there may be something going on, because we're all kind of living in an adjustment disorder. With that said, if you entered the pandemic with a mental health or addiction issue, you're very susceptible to getting worse or developing another mental health or addiction issue. And so I think while we can normalize it, it's probably your brain giving that warning signal that it's okay to feel stressed during this time. If you do not feel like yourself and you can't kind of get back to where you think you need to be, you may have developed a depressive episode, and we can help you get out of that as well. So seek care.
Those are wonderful comments. And just a few things I want to pull out from that is, I think common language when talking about depression can act as a bridge. I think the pandemic has created more of an environment where it's okay to talk about those things. And that can be our biggest asset in normalizing and creating that connection between people. So love the comments. Thank you. I do want to mention to the participants who are listening, you are welcome to put questions in the chat and we will get to them as soon as we can. Dr. Inventor, I have a question for you. So where do you think the barriers to understanding depression are the most problematic?
I think we started with that we mentioned about stigma, and I think it's one of the problematic issues, a barrier to treating or diagnosing stigma. Stigma can be expressed in so many aspects. It could be a stigma against mental health, like mental health. If you're depressed, if you're anxious, you might be viewed as being weak, or for men, it may be a loss of their masculinity, so they don't want to seek out help, treatment. We see this stigma in different cultures, that it's viewed as not being good. It's not part of you being alive. There should be reasons for you to be depressed, and it's okay to be depressed. So there's stigma with that. In older adults, there's stigma with that as well, because one is ageism to begin with, that it's being depressed. It's acceptable that as you age, you'll be more prone to be depressed because you have more comorbidities, you lose your physical abilities sometimes, and so it becomes part of you. Like, it's an accepted feeling for many folks that they can be depressed. People in nursing homes, it's like, oh, I'm in a nursing home, who won't be depressed? But it's not. We should negate those feelings. And I think the stigma is really the number one, the problematic thing that we see a lot. Access to care is another issue. Not many people who have mental health issues have access to good psychological help. And so it becomes difficult to recognize and treat them. Finances, insurance, and all those things are actually barriers. But we start with those things: stigma and access to care, and I think those are problematic barriers.
Dr. Nelson, what are your thoughts on that?
I totally agree. I think the second point, access to care, I see that becoming a larger problem that we're facing. I was talking to my husband. I was saying, you watch television programs now, and if it's talking about a sensitive subject like depression or suicide, at the end, they will say, if you have a mental health disorder, seek help from a mental health professional. But access to mental health professional, quality mental health professionals, is limited depending upon where you are. So I think, especially with so many more people needing help, that's something that we really have to address in healthcare, being able to provide the resources to patients. We get patients all day who call and, they can't wait to get in to see myself or one of the providers who work with me. So I think those are things that we really will have to address pretty quickly within the next few years following COVID for our clients.
Yeah, and in our large health system, we've got about 3,000 providers or so, 21 points of care. Just in behavioral health alone, we were able to go from like 700 virtual visits to over 50,000. Mm-hmm. And so maybe that's another silver lining, is the ability to quickly have upscaled virtual. At the same time, though, I think we really need to have access to excellent care. In behavioral health, we've had such a dearth of providers. We've been talking a lot over the last 10 years around access, but we need access to like the newest science, evidence-based techniques and psychiatrists and therapists that you feel like really listen to you and can walk alongside you. And then again, with that said, if you were to see me as a psychiatrist, it would be maybe tomorrow, and then in 4 weeks, I could change a medicine, 4 weeks again. That's such a small slice of someone's life that they're spending with me. Our whole healthcare system isn't really built to serve people along them walking in the community for the other hours of their life. And so we really need to be doing more in places of faith congregations, community centers, getting into the housing business. We have to walk alongside people where they are, not just deliver it in our kind of sterile clinic settings.
Yes, you stole the thoughts out of my head. I was just saying, so how do we address this? And it seems like meeting people where they are, and not only meeting them, but having excellent care where they are as well, is some way that we can combat this. Which leads kind of nicely to my next question. I'll start with you, Dr. Nelson, and then open the floor to everyone. How do we view the role of primary care doctors in this disconnect, as well as access for patients for mental health care?
Well, I think that the disconnect part, almost all of my close friends are primary care. So, God bless them and what they have to do and the amount of time that they have to address so many issues with patients because of the healthcare system and the way that, we operate. But, I think sometimes the primary care doctor, in using your words, is not meeting the patient where they are. Sometimes the primary concern is the depression, the anxiety, or at least the priority. And because there are so many other health concerns and the time frames are short in which the patient has to spend with the primary care doctor, I think that adds to that first point of not feeling heard, not feeling understood. We get referrals from primary care every day, and that is again, a common complaint. I shared it with my primary care doctor. They didn't listen. They didn't hear me. And I think that involves so many things. Probably we don't even have enough time on this to talk about what would need to change. But I think for primary care doctors, doing exactly what you said, maybe focusing on meeting the patient where they are. What is the patient's primary concern? You may be more concerned with the cough, but the patient may be more concerned with their panic attacks. So addressing what is the most important thing to the patient. And we have to ask, in primary care, we have to ask about mental health. It's important to treat it just like every other system that we might be checking off the box when the patient comes into the room.
Primary care is the entry point for healthcare, right? By the time, and many of the psychiatric, conditions, including depression and anxiety, are initiated in primary care. And many medications are prescribed, antidepressants are prescribed in primary care. So it's good to have that kind of entry point. If we normalize mental health assessment in primary care, then that becomes an entry point for the patients. And I'm glad that you brought Dr. Nelson about meeting where the patients are, right? They're hearing their own stories, because it's very important to hear patient stories, what they came there for, what matters for them. And so it's very important to do that. I remember the 4M's model of the geriatric age-friendly health systems, that what the first M is what matters to the patient. So what matters to them is what we are there for. As a clinician, we may think that this is more important, but as a patient, no, this is what's important to me, and we need to address this first. In a limited time that a primary care practitioner is given, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, what matters, you would engage patient more, you would engage them in clinical decision making more, if what matters to them is what you're helping them deal with.
Hey, I just wanted to note an amazing comment that's in the chat from someone really brave to share about her depression and maybe beginning a trial of ECT. And, you know, ECT is one of our best treatments. So I really hope that that will help you. In terms of how can you help your provider understand that you're not fully in control of your disease, I think that's such a wonderful point, because the disease of depression is one where you maybe are not fully in control of it. And it's really hard for us as providers to wrap our heads around a disease that takes away that volitional component. We know, especially in addiction issues, we have this like front part of our brain that is kind of our higher ordered thinking, helps us with decision making. And then we have like our primitive, deep part of our brain where we're just on autopilot. And that's good when we need to like breathe all day and not think about it, or drive home and not think about it. But really, when depression or ADHD, it kind of kicks off the parts that give us control. So the disease of depression is not having control. So I would love for you to try to express that to your provider, and I hope that they would warmly understand that. Going back to the discussion around primary care, I just want to peel back the curtain a little bit from a big health system. Healthcare is moving from a fee-for-service model to a pay-for-value model. So before, if you saw me, I would charge you $100, you would pay $100. And if you look at big health systems, really, we should be moving in a direction where physicians get paid when patients are better. And so that's paying for value. And this is a very complicated topic, but a lot of the contracts for the insurance companies, they all have this depression screening measure in it. And this is not going away. This is in fact getting bigger and bigger. So healthcare providers are really being forced to screen for depression, which on the surface is a great thing. But we have focused so much on screening for the last 10 years and trying to hit these very complicated measures that we are really underdeveloped on actually treating depression. And in fact, in just a few months, January of 2022, someone out there in big decision-making territory way above my pay grade decided that suicide assessment will no longer count as follow-up for depression screening. And so in our health system, where physicians are screening at the 90th percentile, that means we did 300,000 depression screens last year. We're not going to get credit. Big payers are really forcing us to get a quick referral to a behavioral health provider, which is not a bad thing. That makes great sense. But healthcare is just always changing, that it keeps physicians away from just spending that time listening to you. And so, that might just be a little bit of why it's hard to connect with the provider. There's a lot on them.
Yeah.
That definitely helps provide some transparency into almost what goes on behind the scenes of medicine. I know when we seek out a healthcare provider, there's a certain level that we expect to reach with them, connection, but it's hard on both sides. And so I think, engaging with your primary care provider on what matters to you, like Dr. Inventor said, is critical in being your own advocate. But I think back to a point Dr. Felkel made about engaging community partners. I wanted to dive into that a little bit deeper, because I do think people are immersed in their community. They have trust with the people that they choose to be around, whether that's a faith-based organization or a certain group. So Dr. Nelson, I'll start with you. How do you think we can get community partners to engage in this mental health space and be almost a branch for mental health and assist in this process?
Yeah, so I think that's spot on, that we really have to get out in the community. And Dr. Felkel said really that aiming to provide excellent care. And, as a psychiatrist or a mental health provider, you could go into a church and you could talk to, the health and wellness ministry at a church and train 20 people in a few weekends to be your eyes and ears of 100 people in the church that you may never be able to get to. So that, I think that is something for us on the healthcare side, to not just see our job as solely in the hospitals or in the offices, but the churches, the community organizations, all of those places and spaces for us to reach out to. I know that again, we are usually so to get to that excellence that all of us went into medicine for. It does require that. It does require us being able to bridge that gap.
In our as a director of the primary care NP program at Rush, we have had we need to be intentional of our extending support to the community. And one way that I would just plug this in is, one way is our students, when they're having their doctoral doctoral project, some of them are really focused on mental health issues. So we have had students make projects on trauma-informed care in school-based systems, in community health centers, in senior care centers. And so bringing that awareness also out in the community, maybe one of the first steps that to bring awareness of mental health, that help is there. You don't have to deal with depression alone. You don't have to deal with the feelings of suicidal thoughts alone. There's help out there. And so if you being aware, extending that awareness to all the community partners that we have, then yes, that probably will be one step to at least open that door to have partnerships and dealing with mental health.
We typically say that depression is a biological brain disorder, and that's absolutely true. But it's interesting, where I live in Greenville, South Carolina, we did some prevalence data through NAMI, Mental Health America, Greenville County Behavioral Health Coalition. And we really found that depression, first of all, 23% of people in our community had thought about suicide in the past year. I mean, so that's 1 in 4 people. That's just a tremendous, shocking number. But it really did also cluster around zip codes, because we know that, like Dr. Inventor said, trauma, safety, food insecurity, housing, it's just place, if you don't have kind of those building blocks to keep yourself, it's hard to be resilient. And so as we think more about the future, and people are, it's become a buzzword now, but the social determinants of health. But the main thing about that is that the clinical role for improving one's life, length of life, or quality of life, is just about 20%. That's the impact that we can have as physicians or nurses on someone's life. The much bigger component is everything else that goes on in the community. And so we need to be aggressively pursuing that type of work. I'm definitely not the first person to say this, but we typically will say depression is not a casserole condition. Whenever I've got 3 little boys, whenever we would have a baby, we would get food from our church for like 3 to 6 months. And if someone unfortunately gets cancer, you get food, you get put on that food train. If you have depression, you typically aren't getting food because you withdraw. That's part of the condition, like this loss of control that we heard about earlier. So that is exactly why we need to be delivering care through places where people know each other, so that when that person in the back pew is not present for several Sundays in a row, we can reach out to them. In healthcare, we kind of only know our panel of people and who come into our office. It's really hard to know who doesn't come in. I mean, that's what we're trying to get to, but that's why we need everyone on this call working together.
I love that. Sorry, Dr. Nelson, were you about to say something?
No, you can go ahead.
So I think one thing I'm hearing, a narrative I'm hearing kind of laced into all of these conversations, is the concept of the mind versus the brain. My background is in neuroscience, so I studied how those cells work in the brain. And like you said, and everyone's repeated, it's an organ. And we need to think of depression as a biological disease rather than some sort of weakness of the mind. And so I think I would love to hear your comments on, do you still hear that in practice, that there is a stigma that it's a disease of the mind rather than the brain? And if so, how do you think we can address that and try to shift that perception of depression?
Yeah, I mean, yes, so patients still will say that their loved ones around them feel like it's something that they're doing, that they're in control of, like we mentioned, that they're in control of, that if they, think positive thoughts, they could get themselves out of it if they just try harder, or, all of the likes. And again, our role is to be that place and space for them. There's no judgment. No one knows exactly how anyone is feeling. So, it isn't really for me to determine whether it was something that you caused or you didn't cause. My goal is to address how you tell me you are feeling, because the experience is still real. And so I think that that's one of the things that people have to, again, like I said in the beginning, I try to pull clients away somewhat from trying to get everybody to understand what you feel, because by nature you felt it. It's real. It's real. That is, your brain gave you a signal about the outside world or the internal world. That's real. You didn't make that up. You didn't make that happen. It was a real experience. So again, just trying to normalize, like Dr. Felkel and Dr. Inventor have said, this is the brain. Everything that we do, all the functions that we experience, this is happening in our brain. So, whether you thought it up or whether there was a malfunction in some genetic component, it was an experience that happened to you, and that's enough. So
also to want to add that as well, there are many things that happen in our life that could justify why a person is being depressed. And some people use that justification so as not to seek treatment. I have this disease, I have this chronic illness, I lost my arm. Those are terrible things to happen, but many people use the circumstances around them to justify, and then the reason that I'm depressed because I'm in a nursing home, and then they don't seek out treatment. And so those are probably some people that are harder to manage, because of you become your relationship with them becomes the important factor in how to peel off those issues from them. But then if you could look at a depression and say, these things are happening, but they are not justification for you to feel this way forever. That depression will decrease your quality of life because of something happened. So those are the things that you could tease out and with your working relationship with the patients.
it looks like we're getting quite a few questions in the
Yes.
chat.
I know we have very good engagement, and I'm excited about all these questions.
Yeah.
I have a few of them pulled up here in particular, so we'll just start working through them. So thank you to the audience. These questions are amazing. We'll start with, what are the signs of depression when dealing with a family member? And how do you discern whether someone is having an adult tantrum or they're having an anxiety attack?
There's a question also around like a kid, so I can kind of lump some of this stuff together. But just before I do that, I just wanted to say that this is how, it's funny, some psychiatrists are like more biologically driven, some are more like psychodynamically therapy driven, and then there's people in the middle. We're a big heterogeneous group. But the way I kind of, just going back to the mind comment, the way I've always conceptualized it, which just makes sense to me, it may make no sense to you all, but if the point of the lungs are to breathe and the heart is to pump blood, and I hope we don't have any cardiologists on here, the heart's not that special, it just pumps blood, it's a big valve. It does have its own heartbeat, which is cool, but the point of the brain, in my conceptualization, is to create the mind. So you could totally get off on a tangent around how LSD, these experimental things, could help escape the parameters of the mind to get back into the brain. They're doing research on that. But I do think that if we say there's some problem with the mind, it's probably more correct to say that that might be because there is a problem with the brain, which is producing that functionality. So I don't know if that helps anyone, but that's just how I think about it. If you have a family member that's struggling with, say, depression or these outbursts, and again, because I'm a child psychiatrist, I kind of see adults as big kids that maybe developmentally were arrested at some point. Outbursts are very, very hard to distinguish between. At the bottom core could be impulse control. A hidden pandemic right now is sleep apnea with people being overweight and metabolic syndrome. They're not getting restorative sleep. If you don't get REM sleep or N3 deep sleep, you're going to be more impulsive. That frontal lobe that controls behavior is going to be offline, or it could be depression. So typically when we talk about depression, its time frame is 2 weeks, and then you have to have a cluster of symptoms. One of them has to be a depressed mood or feeling hopeless or helpless. But it sounds like if someone is having these symptoms, it'd be important to get them evaluated because it could also be bipolar. I saw there was a question there around that. There's different types of bipolar, and often bipolar looks like depression for the majority of the time until there's this one episode of increased sustained irritability or elevated mood. And then I'll answer one more question, then turn it back over to you, Dr. Earls. Is it okay to talk to a kid about suicide? Everyone on this call, talking about suicide will not induce suicidal thinking in your kid or family member. In fact, you'll see this kind of wave of relief come over them when they can finally just get that out. One of the best tools for handling suicide is called the Lighthouse Project, or the Columbia Suicide Severity Rating Scale, the CSSRS. And it's validated for teachers to do, bus drivers, church pastors. So very simple, 3 questions. And if you answer yes to some of them, you can ask 3 additional ones. A lot of people think about dying. I'm kind of scared to say this, but I almost think, I'm not saying it's normal, but I think it is typical for people to wish that they would die momentarily. This world that we live in is so dang tough that the only escape sometimes feels like to go to sleep and not wake up. However, some people then think about actually having intent on not waking up by doing something, or they have done something. So there's all of these different varieties of suicidal thinking. And so just starting the conversation with the kid to say, tell me what you're thinking and feeling, and then pausing and letting them say it. And then this is the hardest part. Don't get angry, scared, judgmental. I mean, you can feel scared, but under the surface, but just listen and let them feel safe explaining to you how they feel.
Yeah, I think that same thing for adults. I know that people will get very nervous about talking about suicide when we get to that topic, even with family, friends. And I encourage, have the conversation and set aside your fear that by talking about it, that you're going to trigger, someone to act upon it, because most people ultimately do not want to act upon it. But the thought, like Dr. Felkel said, is pretty normal to want to escape physical or mental pain. It's pretty normal to want to get relief from that. So I think the conversations like this, just conversations in general, have never induced people to act. It gets people talking, which is what we want to do.
So again, it sounds like that language and the communication is what is going to bridge those and their family members who may be suffering from depression. And one other question we got, which I think falls under this umbrella, is how can I include my family in treatment without feeling like I'm an extreme burden, which perpetuates the feeling of extreme guilt? So would you say kind of a similar response to the previous question?
Well, I would definitely always encourage anybody who is pursuing treatment for depression, if you have family, to include your family in on what's going on, because oftentimes they want to help you, and they may not know how. They don't understand. They're trying to understand. So you may not be able to put it in a way that they could, but maybe the provider can. So including them on the treatment. There's also, I tell my patients this often, there's a payoff that people get from helping. So, like Dr. Felkel said, people bring you the casseroles because they want to help you. And if your loved one is feeling helpless because of not knowing how to manage your depression and you exclude them from your treatment, they're further feeling helpless in this because they're going through an experience as well. So include them in on the treatment, give them the opportunity to try to understand, to hear it in different ways so that they can be able to support you in your journey. It might take a couple times. Maybe they don't get it the first time, maybe the third or fourth time they do. But if you exclude them, then they cannot.
I also wanted to add about family support system and caregivers. Oftentimes we focus on the patient, but then sometimes we forget to assess that their family caregivers are also suffering with them or have issues with them. For those with chronic diseases, the quality of life decrease from the family caregivers. So if the family caregivers provide billions of care, amounts of care for the healthcare system that we are not paying for. So if the family caregivers break down, then it raises the cascade of issues that we will see in the healthcare. So I also want to encourage that as we help our patients, we also assess the caregivers themselves, because they may be depressed as well, or they may be anxious as well, or very, very stressed. And so we can provide care for them as well. Because sometimes as a provider of care, we don't necessarily take care of ourselves because we want to care for other people, and then not knowing that we ourselves need help. And so
I think that family dynamics have to be one of the most complicated things that anybody deals with. I feel free to disagree. I feel like every individual in this world probably is dealing with something. And if someone's not, they're just really good at kind of covering it up. I do think some people have kind of this glass half full temperament and life may be a little bit lighter, but everyone is dealing with something. And the issue that happens in families is there's usually like the identified patient. There's one person that tends to struggle a little bit more. This happens a lot in marriages. Like a wife is always kind of focused on helping the husband. And that sets up a very tough dynamic. I mean, this is why we have family therapists trained to deal with two individuals within the same session. And then those people may have their own individual therapists, just speaking to how complicated things can be. There's a comment or a question here. Do you have insights on what has helped non-depressive people gain understanding in the past? I think that's a great question. That's what this webinar is all about. And I would say I don't have that figured out for sure. We've talked a lot about seeking to understand and listening. I think for me, I don't struggle with depression, but I struggle with other things. And those things in my life feel like I don't always have control over them. And they become this snowball that kind of roll out of control. And then I have a very short temper with my kids some nights. And so I think about like, how do I not have control and how does that affect me? And then I can kind of like project that onto someone else to say, this is what they're dealing with, which is relatively perhaps the same thing, even if I'm not going to truly understand what it's like to feel depressed.
It's wonderful. And I think we're talking a lot about the weight that the family dynamic can play in this. And some of us, as you mentioned, don't always have the best family dynamic. And so in a situation, I think this relates to, how do we deal with that if your family dynamic isn't what you were hoping it would be? And then particularly, we just got a question that says, how do you deal with depression when it's at least partially linked to gender identity issues and people being invalidated for those? I'll open that to anyone.
Yeah, I mean, it's still really kind of coming back to the same thing of that, you know, the further, or I would say the more that we go through, the harder it is for us to find, you know, many people that can relate. And if you're talking about, you know, gender identity issues, again, kind of putting ourselves in even smaller of a group of people. So making it hard for other people to relate. One of the, in relation to the previous question, you know, sometimes the language that I will use with my clients is I will tell them if they're talking to their loved one or they're talking to someone, you know, to try to get them just to relate to a feeling, you know, because we spend a lot of time trying to get people to relate to exactly what we're going through. And again, that might be, you know, never. So I will, you know, have them use the language to, most people have felt just about every feeling that they're going to feel by the time they're about 25. The intensity might change, but you felt sadness, you felt anger, you felt confusion. So when you're talking to your loved one, you know, trying to explain it to them, maybe you can't relate to me and exactly what I'm going through, but you know what sad feels like. Imagine your saddest day, and I feel that every single moment of my day. Or imagine your worst moment. Just trying to give them some language to communicate to their loved ones. And with gender identity, again, making it harder. I think it's a really, really important, no matter what we're going through, whether it be gender identity or anything that would further separate us from general population, to really, really seek someone or a group of someones to help you to be able to talk freely. I think that's important, to have a place and space where you can talk freely, where people can relate. Sometimes that takes a little bit of effort, but it's important for all of us to have a safe space where when we talk, people get us. So.
Right. This safe space is very important when it comes to gender identity issues. Many of our brothers and sisters with gender identity issues don't feel validated in their own families, in their own churches, in their own social support system. They don't have support system to validate their own gender identity, and it becomes an issue. So my suggestion is then seek out the support that you need. It may not come from your blood relatives. It may come from the relatives that you choose, your friends who became your family, and seek out there, start there too, that you start feeling validated, so that you gain more confidence to accept who you are, and seek out therapy if needed. But support system is very important.
Dr. Nelson, I think it's so powerful what you said, that people can relate to a feeling rather than a specific event. Not everyone's been in your shoes, but we've felt sorrow, we've felt joy. And I think focusing on that common language is a very powerful tool. And I think it transitions really nicely into a question that we had, Dr. Felkel. We have heard you use the term cultural humility. And I want to ask, what does that mean to you, and how does it impact mental health and treatment?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. And to be honest, I'm still trying to figure out what it means to me. I've been trained on cultural competency, and within that stance, it's really learning somewhat factual knowledge-based training that this culture should be struggling with this or resilient with that. And as our country has just grown in diversity, it's really hard to know facts. They're kind of outdated already. And especially, so I deal a lot with survivors of human sex trafficking. I'm the medical director of a home where we rescue these women. And in fact, one of them, she's been sex trafficked from age 9 and is dealing with gender dysphoria. And so just very complicated. So instead of us presuming that we know what someone should be like cultural humility. It's more about us. It's about approaching ourselves with humility, a humble nature, seeking to learn how we react to things, always self-reflecting. In medicine, we talk a lot about being a lifelong learner. I feel like we should be constantly in every interaction with someone trying to relate to them, learn what it's like to walk through life in their shoes, and in doing so, connecting with them.
And we try to be culturally competent in our management, in our approaches with patients. And I tell myself that, you know, this is a new thing. The cultural competence and cultural humility is, we probably practiced that or at some point had faced that, but we're not competent enough to really be culturally competent. We're not skilled to be culturally competent and to just have that intention to know other cultures and how the cultures affect their lives. We may be clumsy at the very beginning, but we'll get there. We'll be excellent provider later on. But as we learn these things, we may be clumsy, but it's okay. Well, we can get there. The road to excellence.
I love that. Very positive. We are going to have one more question from the audience, and for any questions that we don't address, we will follow up with you after. This time always flies, so I'm sorry we can't get to all of them, but we'll do one more and then we'll end with some final tips. So Dr. Nelson, can a person have temporary depression over a specific reason and not be clinically depressed? If so, how does one go about getting through that?
Yeah, I think in medical school when we were training, one of my attendings used to say, you can have do you have the little d or the big D? Meaning the little d, depression, depressed feelings, depressed mood, which could be circumstantial, or do you have the big D, clinical depression, meet DSM criteria for depression? And, you know, just like Dr. Felkel said, all of us can be prone to having the little d. I mean, goodness gracious, we went through a pandemic. And if you weren't stressed out or experiencing the little d at some point, you know, where did you live? So, you know, I think, yes, absolutely, you can have sort of a depressed mood in relation to circumstances and not be clinically depressed. So if that experience for you is starting to last longer than 2 weeks and it's affecting, you know, work, home life, it's starting to cause dysfunction in multiple areas, then that's where you might want to say, maybe this isn't just a temporary depression based on circumstances. So all of us had some depressed mood relating to the pandemic, but did it start to interfere with all of our areas for longer than weeks, you know, a couple of weeks on end? Were we still able to get up? Were we still able to function? If you find yourself not being able to do that after a couple of weeks, then you probably want to talk to your primary care provider or seek out a mental health provider. But all of us are prone to having depressed mood based on circumstances temporarily. It's when it starts to interfere with all those other areas of our life that you really need to, at that point, think about it as something a bit more serious than just temporary.
Yes.
Thank you. It's very helpful. So we have a few more minutes. Dr. Inventor, I'll start with you. I think it would be really helpful to wrap this up with what you think are maybe one of the most critical tips or tactics that you would choose to discuss when helping to bridge the gap of understanding. What do you think is the best advice that you could give to people experiencing depression or people who have not experienced depression in order to bridge that divide?
I think the best advice is to put the person first, what really matters to them. Hear their story, because their stories tell about things, about them. Our story is what makes us unique. We could tell stories to share our life, or we could shun others by telling other stories, right? But our stories make us unique. And so if we are listening to a patient's story, we could learn from them the impact of mental health in their lives, the impact of stigma in their life, the impact of other things. Do they have resources? Do they have support systems? So put the patients first. I mean, it's easy to say, right? To say that, but difficult to put in practice sometimes because of everything that's going on. But I would say that listen to our patients. If there's something that's different on them, their stories may differ, or whatever they're saying to us is what we put up in front. Then I think that's the good start. I would start there. I mean, there's so many things that you could do, but starting there would be good.
Dr. Nelson?
I guess overall, I mean, I'll say the same thing that I say to patients. You know, I tell patients, you know, how you feel matters. It's really the only thing that matters, to be honest. You know, I say all day, you either running away from a feeling or running towards one all day, every day, with everything that you do. So if you are feeling in any way a negative way or not feeling, that matters. So if that's going on where it's, again, interfering with all of the areas of your life and getting in the way of the things that you want, then it's time to talk to somebody and, you know, talk until you figure out whether or not there's something that can be done about that. So never dismiss how you feel. I mean, it's really the only GPS system we have.
I see that. I'm just so thankful people are asking these questions. I wish we could get to all of them. A lot of questions around how to, you know, help with a teenager or a significant other that is having a hard time getting help. The hardest thing for me with mental health conditions and addiction issues is the fluctuating nature. There's some really good, okay days, and then there's some really bad days. So anything you can do to develop a plan on the good days that then could be utilized on the bad days is helpful. And I'm just very solution focused. There's this question, this kind of magical wish question. If you were feeling better and when you woke up tomorrow, what would you be doing differently? And not feeling differently. So people say, oh, I'd feel happier. And then I'm saying, no, I'm not asking you how you would feel. What would you be doing differently? And so a teenager might say, oh, well, I would have done this, and then I wouldn't have done that. And then you kind of find some solutions to say, when was the last time that you did that? And what was different about that day? We've talked a lot about feelings, but a lot of this is also behaviors. How can we get people living in a different way so that then their emotions follow?
And Rachel, before you close out, I mean, in the chat, there is a question where someone brought up that money is a barrier for them seeking help for their loved one. And I don't know, you know, where they live, but I do encourage you, if money is a barrier, to connect to your local community service board where money can be eliminated from the equation. So if you have a mental health issue, you can look to your county, just type in community service board in your county and you will find your local community service board where you could make an appointment for yourself, for your loved one, and potentially get them some help. So I didn't want to miss that because they put it over here in the chat. It didn't come through the Q&A.
Yes, thank you for answering that. And for any questions that we did not address tonight, we will get back to you after this. But I want to sincerely thank the attendees who showed up to have this conversation. I want to thank our panelists for their insight. It is invaluable to help bridge this gap between understanding and depression. So thank you guys so much for your time, and I hope you all have a wonderful night.